All right, everyone, here we go with the first part of creating a soft slab textured box. You're going to be using about an inch and a half, maybe 2 inches of clay straight from the bag. You're going to slice off the amount you need with your wire cutter, and then you want to make sure that you don't leave any of that clay out that you're not using. So make sure that you're careful to cut this, pull the wire through, leave yourself about an inch and a half, maybe almost 2 inches of clay that you're going to use for your slab. Wrap up the rest of the clay, leave it out of the way, and then we'll start to clean off our canvas because we don't want any chunks of clay getting stuck into our slab. Once you start, just carefully but with some force, start to pound out your slab with the palm of your hand. Make sure that you flip it each time you finish kind of a pass over the whole surface. Flip it over and make sure that you're using just the palm of your hand as much as possible. You don't want to be using your fingers too much. You're going to leave some finger marks just from the pressure of it kind of hitting down onto the clay. But what I'm trying to do is make sure that I'm stretching the clay side to side just so it's going to be big enough so that the size of my stencil or the size of my template will fit the piece of clay. I'm going to slowly stretch it out. There's a little technique where you can do is lift the corners up and let it slap back down onto the canvas. And then once you have it just wide enough for one direction to go with the template, you can start to thin out the actual slab with your sticks and your rolling pin. Remember to continuously lift up your slab as you roll because it does get stuck to the canvas a little bit. You want to be gentle, but you want to make sure that you lift it up before you take another pass with the rolling pin. Make sure the rolling pin stays on top of the sticks just to make sure that you keep the right thickness throughout. And if you need to, you can kind of adjust the angle of the sticks to make sure that the rolling pin stays directly on top of them. Sometimes you might have to adjust a little bit where you actually have to work on just one side. And if you make a thin spot or a low spot, try to use that or try not to use that section of your slab once you're starting to use your stencil to cut out the rest of the shape. Okay, once you've got it close to being the right thickness, you want to just kind of make sure that you've got all the edges kind of flattened out, and you want to make sure that it still fits for your template. And then you're going to have some extra clay left over that you're going to save for later. So that is going to be saved for later for probably the lid and a couple other features that you're going to add to the box. Now, preparing the slab, be very gentle about picking it up. Try to use the least amount of pressure as possible, and then you want to also make sure that you smooth things out. So take your sponge with a little bit of water, and then take your metal rib, make sure it's clean, and go ahead and just very lightly kind of slide over the surface, and then remove some of that slip that you've created by adding the water, and then compress carefully with the rib. And then sometimes you want to flip it over and use the round side with a very light touch just to get rid of some of the grooves or some of the lines that might have happened from the first couple passes. Barely touching the clay. Now you got to flip it over. Make sure your hands are kind of dry. Carefully peel it back. Get your hands kind of flat to each other, and then flip and then readjust and do the exact same thing you've done on the one side to the other side as well. There's going to be some texture there from the canvas, and you want to get rid of some of that before you move on. Ribbing it like this will strengthen the clay and make your slab stronger when you're trying to bend it so it doesn't crack on you. If you forget to do this part, you might run into a lot of cracking issues when you're starting to actually put the walls together and might have to start over. Now that it's done and clean, I can go ahead and lay my template right on top, and I can kind of measure out exactly where I want it without pressing too hard. I just want to leave it on there, and then I'm going to make lines, extend my lines, my cutting lines directly out from the corners of the wall. I'm going to do all those first. Make sure you keep your needle tool as vertical as possible so you don't have any weird undercuts. And then you're just going to remove that clay and maybe save some of that for later as well, depending on what we do next. Take the top piece off on each of those edges, and now you've created not only the form, but basically the whole entire box shape. template is done. You don't need that right now. And now you can go ahead and start thinking about your texture. I have a texture mat that I'm going to use. And I want to be careful to do this when it's still on the canvas, because if I do it somewhere else, it might get stuck to whatever material I'm resting it on. But if you're on the canvas still, you can release from the canvas and making sure it doesn't get stuck. So that blue mat has a kind of a rock texture on it, and I'm going to stamp each of the vertical walls with that texture very lightly. I don't want it to get stuck, but I also want to leave an impression into the clay that would take a lot longer to do if I was trying to carve it by hand. So the beauty of these texture mats is that you can press them in, and then you get this nice design on the surface, and you can use anything you want for your texture. Just as long as it releases from the clay, it doesn't get stuck in the clay. And if you'd like it, you can go ahead and lift the whole thing off. If you don't, you can press it back down in there a little bit. Make sure the texture is just the depth that you want before removing it. Now, you have to flip over and make sure the texture side is facing down before you do this next step, which is cutting the edges, these bevel cuts. These should be a 45-degree angle, and I'm doing it the exact same time, or the exact same way each section of my slab. So I'm going to have the exact same angle every time, going that way, going in, and then coming back out, going that way. I'm left-handed, so I'm going to work on the right side of the slab each time, or the right side of the wall. If you're right-handed, you should be working on the left side, so you should be doing this kind of in reverse. You should be working on the other side of the actual design, or the stencil. So with my left hand, I'm dragging over on the right side. If you're right-handed, you should work on the left side. Now, each of these walls should be kind of tapered in, the inside edges there, and now I'm going to score the entire edge of my slab that I cut. Just those walls. And make sure that you go on the edge, and then we're going to also do about 1/4 of an inch on the inside of the wall too. So the inside wall of your actual slab is going to be scored as well. And that's going to be for later when we want to reinforce the surface of our corners by using a little thin coil and kind of make a weld up the inside of our actual joints. Okay, now before you start putting the walls together, I'm going to transfer it over to something else so I don't have to keep touching the clay, and I'll be able to rotate the entire piece without having to actually pick it up every time by hand. So slip after you've scored, and this clay is very soft, so you don't need a lot of pressure. You just want to make sure that you work over the edge and then start to bend your walls into the square shape that I'm looking for at the bottom. It's going to be tilted a little bit in, and then I'm just kind of pressing down and manipulating the clay until I get the right angle that I'm looking for. Slip again, fold, make sure that the top of your walls are lining up, the very top, because you want to make sure that they're the same height as you kind of work your way around the entire shape. Now rotate. It's nice to have something to pick up without actually picking up the clay, so you can rotate things without touching your form too much. And then this last wall, I'm going to do both joints at the same time. I'm going to press carefully one side in, get the other one to attach to, make it a little bit more stable, and then make sure it's still level. Make sure that the top edge is all the same height. You don't want one side going up higher than the rest of it. That means your shape is not quite pressed in the right way. And then I'm just going to alter the wall a little bit, make sure it's squared up a little bit all the way down to the bottom. And try to keep my hands fairly clean. I don't want to mess up my texture on the outside. I'm just kind of working my way all the way around at the base, and then I'm going to work my way up towards the rim. Very gently kind of pinching the corner, make sure that slip really squishes out a little bit. And I'm trying to not press the clay too hard because I can leave my finger marks in there pretty easily. On the inside, you can see there's going to be some scored walls, and then you can finish it off next time.